The amber glow of oil lamps cast long shadows across the weathered floorboards of the Devil's Roost Saloon. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and whiskey fumes as Cassius Vane's weathered fingers danced across yellowed piano keys. His melody wove through the cacophony of drunken laughter and clinking glasses, somehow bringing order to the chaos of the frontier town's roughest watering hole. Cassius hadn't always been the quiet piano man in the corner. His hands, now dedicated to creating music, once moved with a different purpose, one that brought death rather than delight. But that was a lifetime ago, buried beneath years of voluntary exile from the man he used to be. Most of the regulars at Devil's Roost knew him only as Old Cass, the silver-haired piano player whose nimble fingers could coax forgotten memories from even the most hardened souls. They tipped their hats and occasionally slid a coin across the scratched piano top, but few bothered to look closely at the quiet dignity in his posture or the haunting watchfulness in his pale blue eyes. "Another one, Cass," called Marla Calloway from behind the bar, her red hair catching the lamplight as she poured another round for the miners at the counter. "Something lively to keep these boys spending." Cassius nodded, transitioning smoothly into a jaunty tune that had boots stomping within seconds. He kept his focus on the keys, but his awareness never left the room, a habit from days he claimed to have left behind. The saloon doors swung open with deliberate force, silencing conversations as a group of rough-looking men sauntered in. Their leader, a broad-shouldered brute with a thick mustache and cold eyes, surveyed the room with the predatory gaze of someone looking for trouble rather than whiskey. "Well, ain't this a sorry excuse for a saloon?" the man announced, his voice carrying an edge sharp enough to cut through the sudden silence. "Briggs Calder's the name, boys. Me and my associates are thirsty after a long ride." Marla straightened behind the bar, her smile tight but professional. "Welcome to Devil's Roost, gentlemen. First drinks in the house for newcomers." Calder's eyes narrowed as they landed on Cassius, whose fingers never stopped their dance across the keys. "What's this? A retirement home for piano players?" His men laughed on cue, spreading out through the saloon like a disease. Cassius kept playing, his expression unchanging as Calder approached the piano. The outlaw leaned in, placing a dirty hand on the polished wood. "Hey, wrinkled piano man, you know anything worth listening to? Or are you just decoration in this dump?" The old pianist's fingers paused for just a heartbeat, long enough for those who knew him to tense. Then he resumed playing, still without looking up. "You deaf as well as old?" Calder pushed, his temper flaring at being ignored. "I'm talking to you, saloon dog." As Cassius finally raised his gaze to meet Calder's, something flickered in the depths of those pale blue eyes. Something cold and dangerous that made even Calder hesitate for a split second. "And if you thought this was bad, wait until you see what these fools have coming. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever encountered someone who was much more than they appeared to be." 25 years earlier, the name Silverhand Vane had been whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence across the Western Territories. Not for the number of men he'd killed, though that tally was substantial, but for how he'd done it. Cassius Vane never drew first. It was a code as unbreakable as iron and just as cold. "A man who draws first is just a killer," he once told a young deputy in Cottonwood Springs. "A man who draws second and still walks away is something else entirely." Legends grew around his silver-handled Colt revolver, how it moved from holster to hand faster than the eye could follow, how the 6 chambers never seemed to empty when justice needed serving. Some claimed he'd made a deal with the devil. Others said his hands were blessed by an angel of vengeance. The truth was simpler and harder. Endless practice, born from the understanding that hesitation meant death. In a saloon not unlike Devil's Roost, Cassius had faced a notorious gang leader named Thorne McCleary. McCleary had laughed at the lean gunslinger seated at a corner table, mocking his stillness for cowardice. "I hear Silverhand's so fast he can shoot a man before he clears leather," McCleary had taunted. "Sounds like tall tales to me." Cassius hadn't moved, hadn't even looked up from his coffee. "Only one way to find out," he'd replied quietly. When McCleary reached for his gun, witnesses swore they never saw Cassius draw. There was just the explosion of gunfire, and McCleary lay dead with a bullet through his heart. Cassius's coffee hadn't even rippled in its cup. But the day came when Cassius's legend claimed an innocent life. A young hothead, eager to make a name, had drawn on him in a crowded street. Cassius's return fire had been perfect, except for the young woman who stepped from the general store at exactly the wrong moment. Her blood on his hands became the weight that pressed the revolver into a chest drawer and pushed the piano keys beneath his fingers instead. Back in the present, Marla Red Calloway leaned close to Cassius during a brief pause between songs, her voice low with concern. "Those boys mean trouble, Cass," she murmured, wiping the bar near his piano. "I've seen their kind before. They don't just want drinks and cards. They want to prove something." Cassius's weathered face revealed nothing as his fingers found the keys again. "They always do, Red. They always do." "Sheriff Drake's out of town till morning," she pressed. "Might be best if you finished early tonight." But Cassius only shook his head slightly, launching into another melody as Briggs Calder and his men grew louder, deliberately disrupting the peaceful atmosphere of the Devil's Roost with their coarse laughter and threats barely disguised as jokes. The storm was gathering. Cassius could feel it in his bones, old instincts stirring beneath his carefully cultivated calm. Briggs Calder settled into a chair at the center of the saloon, boots propped up on the table, hat tilted back to reveal eyes that gleamed with malicious intent. His men spread throughout the room, creating a web of intimidation that had the regular patrons shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Piano man," Calder called out, swirling amber liquid in his glass. "You know the Gunslinger's Last Waltz?" The saloon fell quiet. Even the drunkest patron knew the significance of that request. It wasn't just any song. It was a melody said to have been composed by Silverhand Vane himself, played only after gunfights where men had died by his hand. A requiem for the fallen, some called it. Others said it was a warning. Cassius's hands stilled on the keys. For several heartbeats he remained motionless, his back straight as a fence post. Then, without acknowledgement or comment, his fingers began to move again, drawing forth notes that seemed to pull the very air from the room. The melody started soft, almost hesitant, like a man approaching a grave with respect. Then it built, rising and falling like the chest of a dying man taking his last breaths. There was sorrow in it, regret perhaps, but underneath, a current of steel resolve that made the hair stand up on the back of the neck. Men who'd been reaching for their glasses paused, hands suspended in midair. Women who'd been chattering fell silent, eyes drawn to the old pianist, whose fingers now moved with a precision and emotion that transformed him before their eyes. Calder's smirk faltered. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd wanted to embarrass the old man, to expose him as a fraud who couldn't play the notorious melody. Instead, Cassius played it with the intimacy of someone who knew every note by heart. "Well, I'll be damned," whispered one of the older patrons. "It really is." The shattering of glass cut through the haunting melody as Calder smashed his whiskey bottle against the table. Shards scattered across the floorboards as he stood, his expression twisted with frustration. "Enough of this trash," he snarled, stalking toward the piano. "Anyone can press keys. Doesn't make you anything special, old man." Cassius continued playing, even as Calder loomed over him. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Calder demanded, his voice rising. "Or are you deaf as well as useless?" Cassius completed the phrase he was playing before finally stilling his hands. Slowly, deliberately, he turned on the bench to face Calder, his movements carrying the economy of a man who wasted nothing. Not words, not gestures, not time. "You've got fingers," Calder sneered, his breath hot with whiskey. "But do you have a spine? Show us you're more than just a saloon dog. Or maybe that's all you ever were. A mangy cur pretending to be a wolf." Behind them, Marla moved toward the shotgun she kept beneath the bar, but Cassius gave her an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I'm just the piano player," Cassius said, his voice low and even. Nothing more. Calder's eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. The town sheriff, Wayland Drake, had watched the entire exchange from his table near the door. The thin, graying lawman with deep-set eyes and a silver star on his vest had been nursing the same whiskey for an hour, his gaze rarely leaving the newcomers who'd barged into Devil's Roost. Drake knew Cassius, knew him better than most, having crossed paths with Silverhand Vane before the legend had laid down his guns. He'd witnessed what those quick hands could do when provoked, and he felt the tension building in the saloon like pressure before a thunderstorm. "Calder," Drake called, his voice carrying authority without volume. "Might want to ease up. Man's just playing piano." Briggs Calder turned, sizing up the sheriff with undisguised contempt. "Ain't no law against requesting a song, is there, Sheriff? Or is this piano man special somehow?" Drake's weathered face revealed nothing. "Every man in my town deserves respect." "Your town?" Calder laughed. "We're just passing through, keeping things friendly. Right, boys?" His men chorused agreement, but their eyes told a different story, the hungry look of wolves who'd spotted weakness. Cassius continued playing, but his melody had shifted to something darker, minor chords that seemed to draw shadows from the corners of the room. Those who'd known him longest recognized the change, an unconscious tell from a man who otherwise revealed nothing. "The thing is," Drake continued, setting down his glass, "some men in this territory earned their peace. Might be best to let them have it." Another flash of memory hit Cassius like a physical blow, the young outlaw who'd drawn on him years ago in that crowded street. He'd been barely 20, with a wild look and wilder reputation. "Looking to be the man who killed Silverhand," he'd announced. Cassius had tried to walk away. "Go home, boy. I'm not in that business anymore." But the young gun wouldn't be denied his moment. "Draw, you coward!" When the boy reached for his pistol, Cassius's hands had moved with the instinct of countless gunfights. The bullet found its mark, but not before the boy's wild shot went wide, striking the woman stepping from the store. Her name was Emma Lawrence. She had 2 young children, and her blood had washed Silverhand Vane from the territories, leaving only Cassius, a man seeking redemption, one piano key at a time. Back in the present, Drake's words hung in the air, a warning Calder chose to ignore as he leaned closer to Cassius. "Heard you used to be somebody," he muttered. "Now look at you, just a has-been tickling ivory for coins." Cassius's fingers never faltered, but something cold and remote entered his eyes. Those who knew what to look for saw it, the shadow of Silverhand stirring beneath the surface of the piano man. Calder's gang had grown restless, the initial excitement of intimidation wearing thin without the payoff of genuine fear. They began circling the saloon like caged wolves, bumping into tables, deliberately spilling drinks, and leering at the serving girls. "Careful with those glasses, boys," Marla called from behind the bar, her knuckles white around a rag she was twisting. "They cost more than you're worth." One of Calder's men, a pockmarked brute with yellowed teeth, swept his arm across a table, sending glasses shattering to the floor. "Put it on our tab," he sneered, drawing cruel laughter from his companions. Cassius kept playing, though his tempo had slowed, each note measured and deliberate. To casual observers, he seemed oblivious to the escalating chaos, but those closest to him noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze periodically flicked up from the keys to track movement throughout the room. "Your piano man doesn't seem to care much for your establishment," Calder called to Marla, kicking over a chair as he made his way back to the bar. "Maybe he needs motivation to liven things up." Local patrons began quietly slipping out, the atmosphere having shifted from uncomfortable to dangerous. Only the boldest remained, along with those too drunk to recognize the signs of impending violence. A crash from the far corner drew everyone's attention as another of Calder's men flipped a card table, sending chips and cards flying. "Bunch of cheats in this place!" he shouted, though no one had challenged his play. Cassius's fingers pressed a discordant note, then stilled. His hands rested on the keys, no longer creating music but not yet withdrawn. The absence of the piano's melody left a void that seemed to amplify every other sound. The nervous breathing of patrons, the creak of floorboards, the soft click of a hammer being thumbed back on a hidden derringer. "Maybe you should call it a night, Cass," Marla suggested, her voice low but carrying. Before Cassius could respond, Calder nodded to the tallest of his men, who grabbed Lena, the young barmaid, by the wrist as she passed. She was barely 18, new to Devil's Roost and unaccustomed to its rougher elements. "Let me go!" she gasped, trying to pull away. "Just being friendly," the man grinned, yanking her closer. "Ain't that what barmaids are for?" "The lady said let go," came a voice from near the door. Sheriff Drake, his hand now resting openly on his holster. "This doesn't concern the law," Calder replied, stepping between his man and the sheriff. "Just having some fun, right, piano man?" He turned to Cassius, his smile cruel. "Unless you'd rather show us what real entertainment looks like. Heard you used to be good with more than just those piano keys." Lena's frightened eyes found Cassius, pleading silently for help as the man's grip tightened enough to bruise. Something shifted in the old pianist's expression, a subtle change that anyone who'd known Silverhand Vane would recognize as dangerous waters rising behind a weakening dam. Cassius's hands clenched slowly into fists, then unclenched, his knuckles white before the blood returned. In that simple gesture lay decades of restraint battling against the man he'd once been. The Devil's Roost Saloon had gone deadly quiet, the kind of silence that falls before lightning strikes. Cassius's hands remained on the piano keys, but they no longer coaxed forth melody. Instead, they rested there, poised and still as a falcon before the dive. "I'm asking you politely," Cassius said, his voice soft yet carrying to every corner of the room. "Let the girl go." His tone was conversational, almost gentle, which made the steel beneath it all the more unsettling. Some of the older patrons exchanged glances, recognition dawning in their eyes. Calder's thug tightened his grip on Lena's arm, making her wince. "What are you gonna do, old man? Play me a sad song?" "Last warning," Cassius replied, still not turning around, his back straight on the piano bench. Calder laughed, the sound hollow in the tense silence. "You hear that, boys? The piano man's giving warnings now." He swaggered closer to Cassius, deliberately placing himself in the older man's peripheral vision. "You know what I see? A coward hiding behind a piano because he's too scared to face what's in front of him." Sheriff Drake took a step forward, his hand still on his holstered revolver. "That's enough, Calder. You and your boys need to leave. Now." "And if we don't?" Calder challenged, his men spreading out in a way that made it clear they outnumbered Drake significantly. "You gonna shoot us all, Sheriff?" Drake's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Cassius lifted his right hand from the piano keys. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, but it drew every eye in the room. His finger extended, pressing down on a single black key. The note rang out, deep, resonant, and somehow ominous in the silence. It wasn't loud, but it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, lingering in the air like a premonition. "The hell was that supposed to be?" Calder sneered, though something uncertain flickered across his face. Cassius finally turned on the bench, his movements fluid despite his age. His pale blue eyes fixed on the thug holding Lena, and for the first time that evening, he allowed something of his former self to surface in his gaze. "Let her go." Each word fell like a hammer on an anvil, forging something dangerous in the air between them. The thug holding Lena hesitated, an instinctive response to the command in that voice. Calder, noticing his man's faltering, barked, "Don't you listen to this old fool! He's nothing but—" One of the other thugs, impatient and liquored up, decided to take matters into his own hands. He lunged toward Cassius, meaty fist cocked back to deliver a blow that would have sent the older man sprawling from his bench. "Watch yourself, Cass!" Marla shouted. What happened next left the entire saloon in stunned silence. The thug's fist never connected. Somehow, between one heartbeat and the next, Cassius was no longer seated where the punch should have landed. Instead, he stood beside his attacker, one hand gripping the man's wrist at a precise angle that left him gasping in pain, frozen in place like a statue. "I don't want trouble," Cassius said quietly, his grip seemingly effortless as it held the much larger man immobilized. "But I won't abide disrespect to the lady or this establishment." The air in the saloon changed, charged with a new understanding. This was no ordinary piano player. The thug staggered back, clutching his wrist, eyes wide with shock and pain. "You broke my damn wrist!" he gasped, his face pale beneath its weathered tan. Cassius stood now, straight-backed despite his years, poised with a stillness that seemed more threatening than any aggressive stance could have been. His hands hung loosely at his sides, relaxed and ready. "I merely redirected your momentum," he replied evenly. "Nothing's broken, though it will ache considerably for a few days." Calder's expression had transformed from mockery to wariness, the change subtle but unmistakable. His eyes narrowed as he examined Cassius with newfound scrutiny, taking in details he'd previously dismissed. The precise way the old man stood, the weathered but powerful hands, the eyes that watched everything while seeming to focus on nothing. "Who the hell are you?" Calder demanded, his hand hovering near his holstered revolver. "I told you already," Cassius answered. "Just the piano player." But the atmosphere in the saloon had shifted irrevocably. The regular patrons had pressed themselves against the walls, creating a cleared space around Cassius and Calder's men. Their faces showed a mixture of fear and anticipation, the expressions of people who'd just realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Lena had managed to pull free in the confusion, retreating behind Marla's bar, where the older woman placed a protective arm around her shoulders. "You've had your fun," Sheriff Drake said, stepping forward again. "Now I'm telling you officially to clear out of this establishment." Calder ignored him, his attention fixed solely on Cassius now. "Nobody moves like that without training," he said, speaking more to himself than anyone else. "Nobody that age still has that kind of speed unless—" One of his remaining men, braver or perhaps stupider than the others, lunged at Cassius from the side, a knife appearing in his hand seemingly from nowhere. What happened next occurred so quickly that many would later disagree on the precise sequence of events. Cassius's arm moved in a blur, deflecting the knife with one hand while the other struck with surgical precision at the attacker's throat. Not hard enough to crush the windpipe, but sufficient to leave the man gasping and incapacitated on the floor. Cassius hadn't even appeared to look in the attacker's direction. "I recommend against further attempts," he said quietly. The remaining thugs exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. "Two of you," Calder snapped, gesturing to his men. "Get up here." The men hesitated, their eyes darting between their leader and the old pianist, who suddenly seemed to occupy more space than his physical frame should allow. "Now!" Calder bellowed. "I wouldn't!" came a gravelly voice from the corner. All heads turned to see an elderly drunk straightening in his chair, rheumy eyes suddenly clear and fixed on Cassius with a look of dawning recognition. The sound of shattered glass seemed to catch everyone's attention as Cassius removed his right sleeve, revealing the silver-plated grip of a legendarily revolve that hadn't seen daylight in more than a dozen years. The saloon went beyond silent. It seemed as though even the molecules of air paused their movement. One elderly man near the back, squinting through decades-old memories, suddenly gasped. "Silver? Silverhand?" he whispered, the name carrying through the stillness like a physical thing. The transformation in Cassius was subtle yet complete. He hadn't changed position, hadn't altered his expression, yet somehow he suddenly occupied more space, as though years had fallen away, revealing the man beneath. "I haven't drawn this weapon in years," Cassius said, his voice calm as still water. "And I still don't draw first, never have." Calder's face had gone pallid, a sheen of sweat breaking across his brow as understanding dawned. His eyes darted to his remaining men, then to the exits, calculating odds that suddenly seemed far less favorable. "You can't be him," Calder said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Silverhand Vane disappeared decades ago. Some say he's dead." "Some people say a lot of things," Cassius replied evenly. "Doesn't make them true." Pride is a dangerous thing. It pushes men past reason, past sense, past the instinct for self-preservation. Calder stood in the saloon, surrounded by his stunned men, facing a legend he'd foolishly provoked. And still pride wouldn't let him walk away. His hand twitched toward his holster. "I wouldn't," Sheriff Drake warned, but his voice seemed to come from miles away in Calder's consciousness. The moment stretched like pulled taffy, every second expanding to contain a universe of possibilities. Cassius remained motionless, only his eyes alive with focus, tracking Calder's every micro-movement. "You're old," Calder said, as if trying to convince himself. "Couldn't be as fast as you once were." "Perhaps," Cassius acknowledged. "Only one way to find out." Something in those words, in the casual certainty behind them, seemed to snap the last thread of Calder's reason. With a strangled cry, he went for his gun, hand darting to his holster with practiced speed. It wasn't nearly fast enough. Cassius moved like lightning striking, no wasted motion, no hesitation. The silver-handled revolver appeared in his hand as if by sorcery rather than mechanics, and it spoke once with thunderous authority. Calder's gun spun from his grip before he could even level it, a perfect shot that struck metal rather than flesh. His weapon clattered across the floorboards, spinning to a stop at the foot of the bar. Stunned silence held for one heartbeat, then another. One of Calder's remaining men, either braver or more foolish than his companions, made his move. His hand had barely touched his holster when Cassius pivoted, the revolver tracking with impossible precision. The second shot took the man's hat clean off his head, leaving it pinned to the wall behind him with a smoking hole through its crown. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. Cassius's movements had been so fluid, so impossibly fast, that several witnesses would later swear he'd fired both shots without ever seeming to aim. The legend of Silverhand hadn't been exaggerated. If anything, it had understated the truth. "Anyone else?" Cassius asked, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the dead-silent saloon. The remaining thugs stood frozen, fear having replaced arrogance in their expressions. Their hands remained conspicuously away from their weapons, some even raising them shoulder-high to demonstrate their lack of hostile intent. Calder himself had fallen to his knees, his face a mask of disbelief as he stared at his empty hand, then at the gun lying far beyond his reach. The bravado had drained from him like water through a sieve, leaving behind only the husk of the man who'd swaggered in earlier. I didn't know," he stammered. "I didn't know it was you." Cassius methodically reloaded the two spent chambers in his revolver, his movements precise and unhurried. The familiar routine seemed to ground him, bringing him back from whatever deadly focus had taken hold. "Now you do," Cassius said simply, closing the loading gate with a decisive click. The next few moments unfolded with the strange clarity that follows extreme tension. Sheriff Drake moved forward, his own gun now drawn, though it seemed almost an afterthought given what they had just witnessed. "Time for you boys to leave my town," Drake announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority that needed no further explanation. "And I suggest you ride far and fast." Calder stumbled to his feet, his face ashen. The man who'd swaggered into Devil's Roost full of contempt and bravado now couldn't meet anyone's eyes, least of all those of the piano player whose skills extended far beyond ivory keys. "Let's go," he muttered to his men, who needed no further encouragement. They backed toward the door, giving Cassius a wide berth, as if proximity alone might provoke another demonstration of his legendary speed. As they reached the doors, Cassius's voice stopped them one final time. Mr. Calder? The gang leader froze, turning slowly, tension visible in every line of his body. You forgot something. Cassius nodded toward the floor where Calder's gun still lay. A man should never abandon his weapon. It's disrespectful to the steel. Confusion crossed Calder's face, followed by suspicion. Was this some final test? A trap? Cassius placed his own silver-handled revolver on the piano top and nodded again toward the fallen gun. Go ahead. With hesitant steps, Calder approached his weapon, bending slowly to retrieve it. His eyes never left Cassius, who made no move toward his own gun. When Calder's fingers closed around the grip, a collective intake of breath sounded throughout the saloon. But instead of attempting to use it, Calder simply holstered it with trembling hands. I won't forget this, Mercy, he said. The words seemingly dragged from somewhere deep inside him. Cassius's expression remained impassive. It isn't mercy. It's a reminder that some lessons don't need to end in blood to be remembered. Calder nodded once, then backed out the door. The sound of horses galloping away came moments later, gradually fading into the distance until silence once again filled the saloon. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then, like a spell breaking, the room erupted in excited chatter, with patrons turning to one another to confirm what they'd witnessed, to validate that the impossible had indeed just occurred before their eyes. Cassius quietly returned his revolver to its hidden holster beneath his sleeve, the movement practiced despite the years since he'd last performed it. When he turned back to the piano, he found Sheriff Drake standing there, a bemused expression on his weathered face. Guess the piano's not your only instrument, Cass, Drake said, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. Always preferred music to gunfire, Cassius replied, settling back onto the bench as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Less mess to clean up afterward. Drake chuckled, shaking his head in wonderment. You know the whole territory will be talking about this by week's end. Silverhand's return. Cassius's fingers found the keys, beginning a gentle melody that somehow eased the lingering tension in the room. I didn't return, just reminded some folks that respect isn't an outdated concept. Marla approached, setting a fresh glass of whiskey atop the piano. On the house, Cass, though I reckon you'll be drinking free for a good long while after tonight. Lena, recovered from her ordeal, brought him a plate of food, her eyes wide with newfound admiration. Thank you, Mr. Vane, she whispered. Cassius nodded in acknowledgement, but said nothing more, allowing his music to speak for him as it had for years. The legend of Silverhand Vane would grow again tonight, spreading across the territory like wildfire. But here in Devil's Roost, they would still have their piano player when the sunset painted the western sky. A man who'd found his peace without forgetting who he once had been. And if you thought this was thrilling, you won't want to miss what happens in our next video. An aging lawman confronts the son of a man he put behind bars 20 years ago, with a shocking twist that no one sees coming.